In the quiet, tree-lined town of Willow Creek, nothing much ever happened. It was the kind of place where kids rode their bikes without helmets, people still left their doors unlocked, and the smell of freshly baked pies wafted from kitchen windows on Sunday afternoons. Everyone knew each other's names. If someone missed their morning coffee run, someone else noticed. It was safe, predictable, and that was exactly why no one paid much attention when Julian Marks first arrived. He came in early spring, just as the frost was starting to lift and the first wildflowers poked through the soil. He rented a small cottage near the edge of town, one of those charming little homes with a crooked chimney and ivy growing up its walls. The kind of place you'd imagine a writer or a retired librarian living in. Julian wasn't either. He said he was an antique appraiser, said he traveled from place to place, looking for forgotten treasures hidden in attics and barns, helping people understand what their old possessions were worth. He spoke softly and always wore long sleeves, even when it got warmer. He had a strange kind of politeness about him, not stiff, but careful, measured. His smile was friendly but not too familiar, and his eyes, dark, always watching, seemed to take in everything around him in an instant. People liked him. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was often about old craftsmanship, the way dovetailed joints used to be cut by hand, or how the grain of 19th century walnut could tell you which region it came from. For a small town like Willow Creek, where heirlooms were passed down like sacred relics, he was a welcome curiosity. He began making rounds, visiting garage sales, stopping by the farmer's market, chatting with older residents who still had trunks full of things they never used, but never threw away. He never asked for payment, at least not at first. He'd offer compliments, sometimes even write up little notes with his expert opinion, scribbled neatly in fountain pen. His only request was always delivered with the same quiet reverence. "Can I just touch it?" Whether it was a hand-carved comb, a pocket watch, or a faded photograph, he always asked first, and always with that same careful tone, as if what he was asking meant more than it sounded. People found it charming, even endearing. They said he had an old soul. Some joked that he should be working in a museum. He laughed at that, but never explained why it was funny. At first, nothing seemed out of place. He never took anything, never broke anything. In fact, some of the people who let him examine their items swore that after he touched them, the pieces somehow looked better. Not cleaner, but more alive, as if his attention had unlocked something in them. He told one woman that her broken locket was actually late Georgian and possibly French. Told another that the odd teacup she'd nearly thrown away was a rare transferware design from 1830s Staffordshire. People were thrilled. They started inviting him into their homes, not just for evaluations, but for tea, for conversation, for company. Julian became a part of Willow Creek's quiet rhythm. People began to talk about him as if he'd always lived there, and in a way, it felt like he had. His presence was so unobtrusive, so folded into the background, that no one ever stopped to think about how little they actually knew about him, where he came from, why he chose Willow Creek, or why he never seemed to sleep. Then came the whispers. Nothing serious, just little things. A garden rake found, moved in the middle of the night. A cellar door found ajar when it hadn't been used in years. A child swearing she saw someone watching from a hedge at dusk. Odd, yes, but nothing anyone would panic over. This was Willow Creek, after all. But unease began to grow, not loudly, not urgently, but quietly, like a draft slipping in through a cracked window. People began to realize that Julian always showed up at the right time, always knew which families had valuable items stashed away. He never knocked twice, and never came to the same house more than once, unless he was invited. One evening, Mrs. Claire Wexley, a retired school teacher, hosted a small gathering of neighbors. Julian came late. He brought a carved wooden box, unmarked, and claimed he'd found it in a nearby junk shop. He wanted to know if anyone recognized the style. No one did. but he held the box like it was a sacred object. Someone asked if they could open it. He smiled and shook his head, said it wasn't ready yet. Later that night, after everyone left, Claire noticed something strange. Her family Bible, a leather-bound heirloom from the 1800s that had sat on her mantel for decades, was gone. In its place was a book that looked identical, but when she opened it, the pages were blank. Julian Marks didn't come back after that. Not to her house, not to anyone's. The next time anyone saw him, it was at the spring market, standing behind a booth, selling mirrors. Lila Shore had never been the kind of person to attract attention. She liked it that way. At 34, she had carved out a quiet, comfortable life in Willow Creek, working as a curator at the local history museum. Her world was made up of catalogued relics, handwritten letters from the 1800s, and rows of glass display cases she dusted with the care of someone handling a newborn. She didn't go out much. Her closest companion was her border collie, Benny, who followed her from room to room like a shadow. Lila E.'s home was small but beautiful, a white bungalow with wide windows and a porch covered in climbing roses. Inside, everything was soft and muted. Lace curtains fluttered in the breeze. Delicate china plates hung neatly on the walls. Her prized collection, though, was her Victorian lace. Dozens of carefully folded doilies, shawls, collars, and gloves, each tagged with a note in her perfect handwriting. She kept them in a climate-controlled case in her living room, and visitors were rarely allowed to touch them. So when she brought home a large antique mirror from the Willow Creek Spring Market, everyone was surprised. Lila wasn't known for impulse buys, but this mirror, with its wide oak frame and faintly tarnished glass, was different. She told her co-worker it felt like it belonged to her the moment she saw it. The vendor, Julian Marks, had even offered to carry it to her car. She hesitated, then nodded. He handled it like it was fragile, despite its weight. He didn't speak much, just smiled as she thanked him. Lila drove home and placed the mirror in her hallway, right across from her lace display. She stood in front of it for several minutes after it was in place. Something about the way the glass rippled, distorted slightly, like water, kept her there. Benny barked once, low and unsure, then backed away. Over the next few days, Lila went on with her routines. She fed Benny at 6 sharp. She walked to work. She took careful notes in her ledger. But something started to change. It was small things at first. She began misplacing items: a hairpin, a book, a letter from her sister. Then came the mirror. She noticed the glass didn't reflect quite right. At night, the hallway seemed darker, though every bulb was working. The air grew colder around it, like a draft was leaking through the frame. She told herself it was her imagination. She was last seen 3 days later. On a Saturday morning, Lila bought a coffee and a sandwich from the town cafe. She chatted briefly with the barista, who commented on how tired she looked. Lila smiled faintly but said nothing. She didn't walk to the museum. Instead, she went home. That night, a neighbor walking his dog noticed that the lights in her house were all on, every room glowing as if it were the middle of the day. But by morning they were off. The first sign that something was wrong came on Monday, when Lila didn't show up for work. Her co-workers called her phone. No answer. By noon, someone went to her house. The front door was locked. The windows were closed. Benny barked from inside but didn't come to the door. The police arrived later that afternoon. They broke in through the back door. The house was spotless, undisturbed. Lila's purse sat on the kitchen table. Her phone was on the charger. Her favorite teacup was still half full. Benny, wide-eyed and trembling, was sitting in the hallway, right in front of the mirror. Nothing else seemed out of place. But Lila was gone. No note, no signs of struggle, no indications of travel. Her bed was made. Her toothbrush was dry. The only thing missing was her car, a dark green hatchback. 2 days later, that car was found abandoned 30 miles away, behind a dusty thrift shop off the highway. It had been parked neatly, doors locked. Inside, there was nothing but an empty coffee cup, a scarf she hadn't worn in months, and a single lace glove, carefully laid across the passenger seat. The police revisited her house. This time, they looked harder. It was an officer in training who noticed something odd about the mirror. The glass seemed newer than the frame. When they tapped on it, it didn't sound like glass at all. It sounded hollow. Investigators removed the mirror from the wall. What they found behind it was a sheet of blackened one-way glass. It had been mounted into a hidden frame. On the other side, the wall had been cut open and sealed again, like a passage had been created and then covered. Forensic teams scoured the house. They found no fingerprints other than Lila's and a single, faint palm print on the inside of the mirror's frame. It was smeared, like someone had been pressing against the glass, trying to push through. Julian Marks had already vanished. His booth at the spring market was gone by the time police traced it. The vendor records listed no last name. The phone number he provided was disconnected. The town of Willow Creek, once proud of its antique treasures, had become a town full of locked doors and nervous glances. The residents no longer welcomed strangers, and Lila Shore's mirror, now stored in an evidence locker, had been wrapped in 3 layers of canvas. No one wanted to look into it again. The investigation into Lila Shore's disappearance stalled quickly. With no witnesses, no forced entry, and no trace of violence, the police had little to work with. The mirror, now confirmed to be a modified piece of surveillance glass, was the only physical clue suggesting something more sinister. It had been altered from the inside, fitted with mechanisms too complex for a casual hobbyist. But there were no fingerprints, no DNA, no trace of where it had come from. Just one smudged palm print that led nowhere. Then they found the list. It was tucked between the pages of a dusty, leather-bound ledger Lila had kept on her lace collection. Most of the entries were dates, condition notes, and historical references. But folded between pages was a single sheet of yellowed paper. No title, no context. Just 10 names, written in small, neat handwriting. 9 of them had been crossed out with a fine black pen. One name remained uncrossed: Lila Shore. Detectives began tracing the names, expecting them to be former co-workers or maybe museum contacts. What they found instead was unsettling. Every name on that list belonged to a woman from a different small town across the state. Different ages, different backgrounds. No obvious connection until they started looking at the police records. Each of the 9 women had been reported missing in the last 7 years. All of them had vanished without a trace. No struggle, no robbery, no suspects. All had lived alone. Most had been collectors of some kind. Antiques, stamps, artwork, oddities. And each one, according to family or friends, had recently been visited by a man offering to evaluate their collection. He was always polite. He never overstayed his welcome. He only ever asked to see one item, and every time before he reached out his hand, he asked the same question. "Can I just touch it?" Most said yes. The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the pattern became. Though the women came from different towns, all had interacted with the same man, or at least, a man who fit the same description. He often used the name Julian Marks, but occasionally went by variations: J. Markson, Jules Marek, even just J on a couple of antique show guest books. He never left a forwarding address. He paid in cash. He worked alone. In 2 cases, items from the victims' collections were found months later at estate sales or antique fairs. A family heirloom ring, a music box, a portrait in an ornate frame. The items had been altered, refinished, restored, or slightly modified in a way that made them look different but not unrecognizable. None of the vendors selling the pieces could say where they'd gotten them, just that a man had offered them, cheap. The most chilling discovery came when a retired detective from a neighboring county heard about Lila S.'s disappearance on the news. He reached out, claiming he had worked on one of the missing persons cases years ago. A woman named Teresa Carr had vanished under similar circumstances. The last item she had acquired before her disappearance was a hand-carved jewelry box. She told her sister it had been brought to her door by a man claiming it matched a piece in her collection. She let him inside. She let him touch it. Her case had gone cold. But after hearing about the mirror and the list, the retired detective checked an old evidence box from Teresa's case. Inside was a photo taken from her living room, a wide shot of her display shelf. In the center sat the jewelry box, and behind her, in the reflection of a small mirror on the wall, was a blurry figure watching her. It matched Julian's height, his build. And though the face was unclear, the posture was identical. The case took on new urgency. The FBI was contacted. A task force was formed. They called him the Collector. New information came to light from old police records, photographs, and interviews with relatives of the missing women. In each case, just days before they vanished, they had reported strange experiences. Objects moved slightly out of place, lights flickering without cause, a sudden unease when alone. One even wrote in her diary that she'd been waking up at 3 a.m. every night, always at the same time, always after hearing a faint knock. She never opened her door, but there were no signs of break-ins, no stolen items, no violence. Just a shared sense of dread and the quiet disappearance of women who had something he wanted to touch. And now, with Lila gone and her name left uncrossed on the list, one thing was clear. The pattern wasn't finished. The Collector wasn't done. The break in the case came nearly 10 months after Lila Shore's disappearance, long after public interest had started to fade. Most people assumed she was dead, though her body had never been found. The name Julian Marks had stopped appearing in headlines, and the Collector case had been quietly absorbed into a backlog of unresolved investigations. But it only took one mistake to bring everything back into focus. In the outskirts of Pittsburgh, a storage facility was auctioning off abandoned units. One had been left unpaid for over 3 years. The name on the rental paperwork was fake, James M. Kelly, but the signature matched handwriting on Lila's list. When the new buyer opened the rusted metal door, they expected to find old furniture, maybe tools or boxes of paperwork. Instead, they found something much stranger. The unit was arranged like a miniature museum. Everything inside was organized with meticulous care. Dozens of wooden crates, each labeled in tiny cursive. Inside them were strange objects, things that at first glance seemed worthless. A cracked porcelain doll, a faded photograph of a wedding, a delicate lace collar sealed in plastic, a grandfather clock with no hands. One by one, they were identified by investigators as belonging to the missing women. But it was what sat at the back of the unit that made the buyer call the police. Against the far wall stood a tall, ornate armoire. It was bolted to the floor, its surface painted over in dull gray. But underneath the peeling layers, investigators could see carvings, small, deliberate symbols, repeated like a pattern. It didn't open with a key. When forced open, the armoire revealed not shelves or clothing racks, but a narrow tunnel leading into darkness. Behind the false back was a crawl space, about 6 feet long and 4 feet high, lined with foam insulation and dark, heavy fabric. At the far end was a stool, positioned in front of a one-way mirror. A speaker had been embedded in the corner, wired to a recording device. They found hours of static-filled tape, punctuated by strange sounds, footsteps, breathing, faint knocks, and voices, soft, distorted, and often trembling. The room had been used, and recently. In one corner was a suitcase coated in dust. When opened, it revealed clothing identified as belonging to Lila Shore. Her journal was inside, along with a single, carefully preserved photograph. The photo showed 10 women seated in identical rooms, each in front of a mirror. Their expressions were blank, their posture stiff. The lighting was low, but their faces were visible. All 10 names from the original list were present, including Lila. On the back of each photograph was a date. Each one matched the last known sighting of the woman in the image. For Lila, it was the day she had visited the spring market. The day she brought home the mirror. Experts examined the armoire and crawl space for forensic evidence, but it had been cleaned thoroughly. What little they found, Fibers, hair strands, bits of skin were too degraded for conclusive DNA matches. The recording device yielded more. One segment contained a series of whispers, barely audible, repeating a name over and over, Julian. Another segment recorded heavy footsteps approaching, then stopping, followed by the creaking of the stool. Then silence. The tapes were labeled only with numbers, 10 through 1, counting backwards. The final tape, marked 0, was blank. Word spread quickly. News outlets ran stories on the discovery, calling the armoire the collector's cabinet. Former detectives came forward with new recollections. Families of the victims demanded answers. But Julian Marks remained untraceable. He had no birth certificate, no credit history, no social security number. Every alias tied back to empty addresses or mail drops. He seemed to exist only when he wanted to. One digital analyst managed to enhance the group photo enough to spot something unexpected. Reflected faintly in the mirror behind the women was a figure standing in the corner of the room. Tall, dressed in black. His face obscured by shadow, but his hands were visible, gloved, resting lightly on the frame of the mirror. It was the first confirmed image of Julian Marks. Authorities widened the search, now treating the case as a federal manhunt. They suspected more victims, perhaps many more, who had never been reported missing or whose disappearances had been overlooked due to their solitary lifestyles. A new list was drawn up, this time with 47 names. Only 10 had been originally identified. The rest was still unconfirmed, drawn from tips, sightings, and recovered items. The armoire, now held in evidence, was kept under surveillance. But officers reported odd phenomena: sudden drops in temperature, a sense of being watched, malfunctioning equipment. No one volunteered to inspect it twice. Investigators now understood one thing clearly. Julian wasn't just collecting things, he was building something. Each woman, each object, was part of a structure no one fully understood. The mirrors, the lace, the silence. They weren't trophies, they were pieces of a system. And Lila Shore, with her name still uncrossed, might not have been the last. The town of Willow Creek tried to move on. The spring market didn't return the following year. The museum closed temporarily for renovations, but quietly laid off most of its staff. Lila Shore's home sat empty, its garden overgrown, its windows shuttered. People whispered when they passed it. Some swore they saw a flicker of light in the hallway where the mirror had once hung. Others claimed they heard Benny barking inside, though the dog had been adopted by Lila's sister and moved across the state. No one stayed on the porch for long. The case was no longer just a local mystery. National coverage dubbed Julian Marks as one of the most elusive predators in modern history. Law enforcement agencies from multiple states cross-referenced missing person reports and found more connections. Women whose only common traits were quiet lives, solitary habits, and the presence of some antique or heirloom just before their disappearance. All of them had once said yes to a simple request. Can I just touch it? What had seemed harmless, even flattering, had turned into the start of something sinister. But investigators still couldn't answer the most important questions. What happened to the women? How did Julian Marks operate so invisibly for so long? And what was the ultimate purpose behind the mirrored rooms and the hidden crawl spaces? Then, nearly a year to the day after the storage unit was discovered, something strange happened. A woman named Alice Merrow was reported missing from a town 200 miles away. Like the others, she lived alone, worked at a small art gallery, and had a fascination with historical ephemera, specifically handwritten letters from the 19th century. Her disappearance followed the familiar pattern: a new acquisition, a visit from a soft-spoken man with a collector's eye, and then nothing. But Alice didn't vanish completely. 6 days after her disappearance, a hiker stumbled upon her in a ravine outside town. She was barefoot, wearing only a long, outdated nightgown, and covered in cuts and bruises. She was confused, speaking in half-formed sentences, and kept asking if her mirror was still in the hallway. She was taken to a hospital and placed under observation. When investigators tried to interview her, she could only recall fragments: a tall man in a black coat, a door that wasn't always there. the sound of whispering from inside the walls. She remembered reaching out to touch something, glass maybe, but said it felt warm, like skin. Then darkness. She claimed she'd been gone for only a few hours, though nearly a week had passed. Her fingernails were broken. Her wrists bore deep impressions, as if she'd been restrained. And one thing was certain. Her mirror was missing from her house. Forensic teams scoured her home and found something new. A set of fingerprints, pressed lightly along the doorframe to her hallway. They matched those found on Lila's mirror. The same partials, the same pressure patterns, as if the same hand had been there, again. But this time, there was something else. Embedded deep in the wood of the hallway floor, beneath a floorboard that had been recently pried up, was a small copper coin. Older than anything in Alice's collection. Scratched along its surface was a series of initials and a date, LS, 06/2/17. It was Lila Shaw's birthday. The implications were staggering. Somehow, despite her disappearance over a year ago, a trace of Lila had surfaced in someone else's home. Investigators speculated that she may still be alive, or that, in some inexplicable way, she had become a part of the collector's strange ritual. Whether she had escaped, been released, or left the message deliberately, no one could say. But the coin changed everything. The FBI reclassified the case, no longer just a search for a serial abductor, but a hunt for what they called an ongoing psychological construct. The mirrors, the recording devices, the exact duplication of environments, none of it pointed to random violence. It pointed to a long-term system of control and observation. A pattern too precise to be improvised. Despite increased efforts, Julian Marks was never found. His name continued to surface, briefly, subtly, through antique appraisals, anonymous estate sales, and old shipping invoices. He was always just out of reach. Each time investigators closed in, the trail went cold. The items he once touched were removed from circulation. Museums stopped accepting private donations. Collectors went silent. The armoire from the storage unit was placed in federal custody, but one night it disappeared. Surveillance footage from the evidence facility showed nothing but static for 12 consecutive minutes. When the feed returned, the armoire was gone. In its place was a single lace glove, folded neatly. Today, the case remains open. Lila Shaw's name was never crossed off the list. But after the coin was found, another name appeared on a folded note mailed anonymously to the Willow Creek Police Department. A woman named Eleanor Price. She disappeared 2 months later. And so the pattern continues. He asks, and someone always says yes.